So my question to the panel is, what is your earliest memory of the New Mutants? When do you first remember discovering and encountering this group? Amy, let's start with you.
Okay, so as a baby comics fan, X-Men was my doorway into a lot of stuff. The X-Men animated series, then the comics, and then I discovered actually Generation X, the mid to late 90s team of X kids, and that was the sort of first thing that I was trying to hunt down all of, and one of my favorite characters in it was Husk. So in tracking down Paige Guthrie's history, I was like, she's got a brother, he's got a book, he's done a whole bunch of stuff, and somehow that road led me. I was like, I can't collect all of X-Men, I am a kid, that's impossible, but these New Mutants, this could be my jam. And I got a hold of I love the Sienkiewicz stuff, but the actual original, the Claremont McLeod and then Sal Buscema issues, look, there's some wild stuff that happens in those early issues of New Mutants, but the original graphic novel and those issues are what I bonded to. The thing that they were doing with this incredibly cool, like, no two members of this team are the same. It is very consciously trying to represent a whole bunch of different stuff, and you can judge it by look, it's all going to be very early 80s, it's dense comics, it's Scottish accents, it's a lot of that stuff, but it's what made me a fan forever, and it's why I have mini mates of the New Mutants that have been sitting here waiting to get their movie for a long time. So yeah, that love never goes away. I can't believe Danny Moonstar has a movie. Are you kidding?
Yeah, right. I mean, I hear you, because I had the benefit of growing up with my father. He was an avid comic book collector ever since his youth. So I had this like Library of Alexandria dating back to when comics cost like 10 cents on the cover. And I loved tearing through all the old yellowed pages of the X-Men books. And I tried to get into some of the others, like X Factor, X Force, but for some reason it didn't capture that same feeling as when I was reading the original X-Men books. But when I discovered New Mutants as a kid, I was like, oh, this is cool. These, like, I think it's the same reason people gravitate towards a character like Peter Parker, for example. It feels relatable. It feels like they're going through the same struggles. Not that I was dealing with my own psychic powers. I just had normal headaches. But I think that, for now. So I think it was just like an easy way to draw myself in and project myself into characters that felt like they were of an age that I was. And also just, yeah, even the early art style before the Sienkiewicz of it all, it was just like something that draws you in, and you're like, who are these like, wait, there's another team and they're younger? This is amazing. So yeah, definitely a way to resonate beyond what I was expecting. But Hector, what about you? What was your earliest New Mutants memory?
I was trying to figure it out, and Amy a second ago was describing to our younger viewers the world before the internet, and it was a horrifying world. If you don't have a Library of Alexandria like Dan did, you had to, I don't know what you had to do, but one thing that I did is that I went to my local library as soon as I started to get into the Marvel universe and comic books and superheroes, and the cartoon shows were great gateways, but also the X-Men in the 90s were like incredibly complex. Like by the time that if you went to go get a New Mutants comic in the 90s, Cable was in it. Like it was a completely different book than the thing we're talking about today. So I tried to track it down. I was like, what was my first exposure to these characters and to this idea? And I think it was this book that I found in the library. Years later as an adult, I bought it. And it's this book right here, Marvel, 5 Fabulous Decades of the World's Greatest Comics. This is when Marvel was only 50 years old. And in this book, this is the book where I learned about people like Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and everybody. And in this book, when they go through the history of the early 80s of Marvel, there's the new, they're talking about Sienkiewicz, but they're also talking about what the New Mutants were. And then I remember later I got this book right here, which is like a late 90s, early 2000s, like DK, encyclopedia book. And sure enough, I think my first real exposure to these characters were these little sort of summarized encyclopedic entries where it's like, and there's this whole other team of young people, and they're dealing with demon bears, and they're dealing with Legion, and they're dealing with the Hellions and all this stuff. So I always knew that they were this side concept that came in at a time where, like you guys are all saying, at this point, all the X-Men characters were aged up and they're adults, or they're late teens, early 20s or whatever. And the New Mutants, to answer that question, well, why is this thing still relevant? Why do people still care? Is because it injected back into the X-Men brand the idea of having young people be the central focus of these stories, because I think the further away you get from, and I'm gonna sort of knock Chris Claremont a little bit here for a second. He's an amazing writer, but this dude had some out there ideas, and the further and further away you get from that core idea of what the X-Men are, young people with emerging power and drama, and them dealing with a world that hates them and dealing with tolerance and acceptance and everything. The further away you get from that, and the more you go into space and the Shi'ar and the Starjammers, and that stuff's fun, but like you lose what the X-Men is and kind of should be about. And the New Mutants honestly brought that. And they're also super diverse for that time in the comics, and they're international, and, these characters had accents. And so it's always going to be relevant to have Peter Parker style characters, like you said, Dan, in comic books, because comics are supposed to be for young people to help them learn not to be jerks.
And I think that definitely this comic in particular is instructive in that, because you see these people working through complex emotions, their own tolerance issues, with everything from people who are different than them to people who maybe dabble in the occult. So it's definitely, it's teaching tolerance for outsider art and witches as well. But yeah, I definitely think it resonates with people, much like the original X-Men comics did back in the day, because you're taking these people who are othered by society in some way, shape, or form, who don't fit into a particular mold, and you are not only telling their story, but you also get the heightened action of the superhero story of it all, because, they all happen to have amazing powers. In the chat as well, Megalo Blazemon says, X-Men Evolution was their first exposure to New Mutants. They were fun, carefree mutants who loved to play with their powers, mischievous. And Bruce Paulson says their first exposure was at the theater a few weeks ago. And that's the cool thing about this, is because hopefully this movie it'll open up the world of New Mutants to a new generation of folks who maybe missed out on the comics, because, unlike things with like X Factor, X Force, it doesn't have X in the name, so you might not understand what this is at first glance. You might be willing to just pass it over. So how would you say that they are different than the X-Men? Amy, let's start with you.
Well, I think Hector put the nail on the head. I obviously, with Gen X being my gateway in, I am a sucker for the new set of kids get inducted. Welcome to the X-Men. Hope you survive the experience. All of those things will always sort of work on me as story hooks. And I love it across, I love Avengers Academy, all of the sort of set of young kids ones. And on the Marvel side, the New Mutants were the originals in that mold. They were the first spinoff. They were we think the X-Men are dead. Bunch of kids are coming in. Danny Moonstar doesn't want to wear a uniform because she has things that are important to her, and she thinks that Xavier needs to respect that. And that left a huge impression on me. There's so much energy in those character concepts and those early conflicts, and Xavier trying to figure out, I can't just run every school. I kind of got lucky with my first couple sets of students. I need to figure out how this works with these kids. It was early 80s generation gap energy. And that has it makes them feel so special, and their relationships to each other feel so special. We were talking beforehand, the friendships among this group are some of my favorite relationships anywhere in fiction. And they've had their ups and downs over 40 years of comics since then. But I you literally love to see it.
Yes, and I love to see a lot of that stuff brought to life in this film, but I'm curious for the panel, what did you like the most about how this movie brought the comics to life? So Hector, let's start with you on this one.
First of all, it always depresses me when somebody talks about the early 80s being 40 years ago. Oh my God. Amy, don't do that again.
I had to do the math because I was recently.
Oh my goodness. What was honestly really great about seeing these characters brought to life? I mentioned it a second ago. For some reason, it really does matter to me, but getting to hear Wolfsbane's Scottish accent, getting to hear Ilyana Rasputin's Russian accent, it's even Sam's really Southern, Appalachian, which is specifically written. Chris Claremont writes it in a specific way, with a lot of apostrophes, and it's just very chunky, clunky. It sounds so dumb, but that to me makes the comics even come to life more, because when I will read comics now, when I read the New Mutants now, I'm hearing Maisie Williams, you know what I mean? And it adds one more level of strengthening that reality, of making it just a little bit more real. So that's just one thing that I really, really appreciated about I really dug that, about getting to see him in person.
I will say one of the purest pleasures of going back and reading New Mutants comics is then trying to read Claremont's dialogue aloud, especially for Rain and Sam, just because they do feel like bombastic sort of accents, but they really work for the character. You immediately get a sense in place of who these people are, but it's also just very funny to go back and just be like, all right, well, let's put my Scottish accent to the test. But maybe that's just me.
Wait,
but
can we hear it?
Nah. No, you can't. I can't right now. I would offend too many people and have to issue an apology to the great people of Scotland. So I will spare you. But Amy, what do you like the most about how this movie brought the comics to life?
I will say that I probably my favorite moments of watching them come to life are that they made some I think good choices about sort of who to put at the center of the story. They could have been like, we picked 2 new mutants and we made up 4 new people, and I would have been very disappointed. Not that, I don't also love when original characters come into things, but I like that they kind of knew who they wanted to work with. And honestly, some of the visual touches, like seeing Illyana grab that sword and armor up, that just was a very cool moment to get to see brought to life. And that stuff's really going to stick with me.
Yeah, and you get that little glimpse into Limbo as well. Like Colossus, far and away, I think. It used to be Nightcrawler for a long time, but Colossus, I think, is my favorite overall member of the X-Men. And I've always had a soft spot for Illyana as a result of my fandom of Colossus, too. So just getting to see that, and also just see, like, her bringing a sword out of nowhere, then cutting a hole through space and time to another dimension, that was pretty awesome. But I think for me, my favorite aspect of this, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on in the show, is getting to see, especially going back, I just reread the Demon Bear saga, like on which this movie is based. I went back, and some of the scenes in the movie, they take Bill Sienkiewicz's art, it's basically transposed onto the screen, like, where you have Cannonball and Magic squaring off with this gigantic demonic bear. And obviously not in some sort of mythical Badland plane this time around, but still a fitting place for a showdown. But just getting to see how they really captured the aesthetic of that artwork, which had such an impact on me when I first encountered it, it was really awesome to see on the big screen.